All right, good evening. Welcome to the convening of the Vermont Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel. We will begin with introductions, but first I just want to ask Tony a quick question. Tony, are you okay on your end as chair of our audiovisual club?
Yeah, as best I can tell, we're good right now.
Okay.
I don't know, Bob, if you just want to say something just so we can check again that you're still on?
Well, I'm still here if you're still there.
Okay, then we're good to go.
Is Bob the only one
Okay.
We have one other member of the public with us this evening, Vina Gooby, who is from state of New Jersey and has been following this closely because, well, she has to deal with decommissioning for Oyster Creek.
All right, great, welcome. So just as a reminder, because we have a member participating by phone, we'll need to do roll call votes when we have votes. So why don't we start with introductions, beginning with Laura down at the end.
State Representative Laura Scalia.
State Senator Mark McDonald. I represent this panel on in natural resources and in Senate Finance Committee.
Sorry.
We all set? Bob Leach, appointed by the governor.
Derek Jordan, citizen.
Josh Under, Governor appointee.
Mike Andrew, County Mayor, please.
Lissa Weinman, citizen representative, appointed by Senator Pro Tem Tim Ash.
Oh, Chris Campany, Wyndham Regional Commission.
June Tierney, Commissioner, Department of Public Service.
Emily Bodecker, Commissioner, Environmental Conservation.
Bill Irwin, Vermont Department of Health, representing the Agency of Human Services.
Corey Daniels with NorthStar.
David Pearson, NorthStar.
Bob, can you just identify yourself for the record, please? Bob, can you say that again? We've suddenly lost you.
Homeland Security and Emergency Management, representing the state of New Hampshire.
Okay, thank you very much. So first order of business is review and approval of the May 2019 meeting minutes. Do I have a motion to approve?
Motion to approve. Bill Irwin.
Who did the second? Was that you, Bob? Okay. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining? A few abstentions. Okay, thank you very much. Actually, we need to do roll call. So, sorry about that. Let me start at the end. Laura?
Abstain.
Abstain.
Senator Bob?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Derek, aye.
Here.
Aye. Lissa Weinman.
Aye.
June Tierney, aye.
Aye.
Bill Irwin, aye.
Corey Daniels, aye.
David Pearson, aye.
And we heard the aye from Bob Gustafson on the phone. Okay. Thank you guys very much. Okay, next on the agenda is Vermont Agency of Natural Resources decommissioning summary.
Actually, is it better if I speak from here? Is this better if I speak from here or from the podium? What do you prefer?
We can do it either way.
Okay. We have a small audience.
Yeah, give me a moment just to pull up your
Slides.
presentation.
Thanks, Tony. This way I get to see people. Excellent, thank you. Well, thank you for the opportunity to address two items that were identified. One is the requirements for VW decommissioning, the permitting requirements from my department, and the second is a summary of the non-radiological site characterization report that we've been reviewing. So to start off with, next slide please. We had a site visit on 9/27 with the relevant experts from the programs to determine what additional permits were needed. And to start off with, on the stormwater permit, an individual construction permit is required. We, in fact, have that application already in hand and anticipate completing our technical review by mid-November. One thing I do want to point out for all of these permits, there is a public notice period for each of those. The mechanism by which my department accomplishes its public notice obligations is through the Environmental Notice Board. So we may want to post some information about that to make sure that people can access this. So this is a permit that will be on public notice for 30 days, and should it be issued, will be authorized for 5 years. Next slide, please. The project will also require an individual stream alteration permit. This is a permit whenever we might be dredging or filling, altering a stream bank, or putting materials into a waters of the U.S. It was again determined that this would be needed on the 9/27 site visit. We do anticipate that we'll have this permit application in hand by spring or summer of 2020. This permit requires 14 days. Well, we anticipate we'll have a draft permit 14 days after the application, and this permit again will have a 30-day comment period. And next slide. So this is the third potential permit from my department, and this is dependent on first on a 404 permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. This is again related to dredging or fill that might go into waters of the U.S. So with this, we actually review the application, the 404 application, and the permit conditions that the Army Corps places to see if there are any additional conditions that are needed to meet Vermont's water quality standards. We do anticipate that this application will be filed by NorthStar by the end of the year, and our review will proceed from that point. So that's the update on the permitting obligations. And now to the limited non-radiological site investigation report. Quick reminder of the timeline that I think many folks here are very familiar with. We actually approved the work plan in June of this year, and the report was submitted by Haley and Aldrich on July 11th, 2019. And this primarily is investigating 17 areas of concern previously identified. And if you go to the next slide, please. Just a reminder here, the map's rather small. It's one of many detailed maps in the report, which provides a lot of detail for those who'd like to get under the surface here. But just a reminder of the different types and the breadth and extent of the areas of concern that were identified on the site. Next slide, please. However, we are pleased with the level of, with the contents of the report, with the low levels of contamination that have been identified. In addition to the review by the Department of Environmental Conservation, we also continue to have the support of our technical contractor, ATC, who has also gone through this review, this report, with a very fine-tooth comb. They are finding no really significant issues in there, but a lot of details that they have clearly gone through. And we provided that information to Haley and Aldrich, and will continue to review that as the comments come back. But on the next slide, as I mentioned, we have been pleased with the results that have come back. Obviously, this has been a site which has been in industrial activity for a number of years. But what we're finding is low levels of some expected contaminants, but nothing at this point that is shocking, unexpected, or at a level that is causing any concern. So just to go over those very briefly, we have found in the shallow soil contamination from PAHs and chlorinated solvents. And we have found in the shallow groundwater some volatile organic compounds from near the fuel tanks and the main transformer. There is actually one location where we found PFAS, likely from the use of AFFF firefighting foam. There was actually a fire at the main transformer at one point in time. There is no water supply contamination that has been identified. There is no bedrock well contamination that has been identified. Bit of a surprise, vanadium was found to be here on the site. It is uniformly distributed and does not appear to have been as a result of the activities at the site, but due again to some analysis from Haley and Aldrich to have been naturally occurring at this location. Going on from here, what's coming up next, I'll just very briefly talk about how we continue this work. There has been quarterly groundwater monitoring, as I think you're aware. We'll be entering into the third quarterly round in November. The reports have come back from the first round, the first quarterly that we're currently analyzing. The second one took place in the summer, and the third will be in November. There's also permanent monitoring wells have been installed at select sample locations and where we've been taking grab samples. And with this and some additional analysis, the next kind of significant step in the process, if you like, will be a formal risk assessment that will process all this additional data and information that comes in. We expect that, in less than a year, but it will be on that kind of time frame. And one other thing I think is worth mentioning here, there has been some groundwater pump testing done in front of the turbine building. And as you're aware, there have been issues with ongoing groundwater infiltration into this building. And once it does enter the building, then it has to be treated with a risk of radiological contamination. So Haley and Aldrich has done some investigation and is proposing that we can actually have a groundwater pumping and interception trench option that can actually reduce the water going in and allow it to be disposed of in a non-contaminated fashion. And just very briefly on a couple of other areas, and I'll leave a couple of minutes for questions if there are any. And this last slide, the asbestos abatement work continues. We have completed the asbestos, or you completed the asbestos work at the cooling towers, and again with no anomalies found. And one other thing I will mention for those of you familiar with the site, you're aware of about 15,000 cubic yards stockpiled of soils from various works and excavation that's occurred on the site over the years. We have, in fact, again, there's a low level of contamination in these soils, but I'd say an innovative way of disposing of them. They will actually be used in the rail cars to actually transport the radioactive waste that needs to go to Texas. So it's important that these rail cars are balanced. So as a result, much of this soil will actually be used in the disposal of the radioactive waste. And although it does not warrant it, I want to make sure that we're not saying there's any contamination that would warrant a level of hazardous waste disposal. Once it has been in the cars and has been shipped to Texas, then it will actually be disposed of at that site. So that's the conclusion of my update in response to the questions asked of my department. And if there are any questions or clarifications needed, if we have time, we can take some questions.
Any questions? Senator?
Here.
All of the reports in here upon which the department determined them to be, in the words of low level or not alarming, have been, who has performed those tests?
So the work is being conducted by Haley and Aldrich, by the contractor for NorthStar, and there are two levels of review and oversight. So both the department's experts are looking over the reports, and we have our own consultant hired, ATC, who is also doing a technical review of both the methodology and the analysis that comes back. So there's two independent eyes looking at the results.
Thank you.
Laura?
Okay. My question is with regard to the groundwater pump testing. And I noted that you said it's reducing the groundwater infiltration. By how much?
So the pump testing that's been done so far is to evaluate if we can put an option in place. And so we actually had to do some initial analysis to see if the groundwater level could be reduced. So it's that initial test that has been done, And what will happen now is a design will be proposed. So this was an initial level of testing to see if in fact a solution like this could work. And so far the indications are positive.
And so what is the level that you'd be hoping to get to there?
Oh, in terms of the actual depth that ground will be drawn down to.
How much would you be looking to reduce in terms of the infiltration, like 100%?
So I don't have that level of detail available.
Okay.
So now that we see that this is likely feasible, we can actually go into the next level of design that Haley and Aldrich will be producing.
And so if it was less than 100%, would that still require trucking?
Obviously, if there's water that is still penetrating into the building, yes, it would.
Thank you.
And just one clarifying point, Laura, just to clarify, I think you said trucking. I think they're now railing it, taking it out by rail now. So, another question? Sherry?
Could you pass the mic? Yeah, I was just curious about the radioactive soil. You said some of it was going to be on the train cars, along with the other shipments. But is all of it going to be removed, or what's going to happen to the remaining soil at the site?
So my department doesn't have jurisdiction or oversight of elements that are radioactive. So that pile of soils was evaluated for other contaminants,
Oh, I'm sorry.
not its radioactivity. So that's something I wanted to make sure was clear. So the fact that it's going in the rail cars
Yes.
is not because it's radioactive. It can be used beneficially, if you like, there to balance the rail cars. But then it will be disposed of at the hazardous site in Texas, even though its level of contamination doesn't require it.
I understand, thanks. It was my mistake.
Other questions?
Commissioner, I'm just interested in the way the samples were gathered. You mentioned that Haley and Aldrich was the entity that was actually gathering the samples from a variety of locales around the site. Haley and Aldrich is a contractor for NorthStar Industries. Did the department have any oversight of the gathering of those samples, or do you just take it on good faith that Haley and Aldrich is providing appropriate samples?
So in the first round, we actually did split samples, where actually 2 samples are gathered at the same time and they're both analyzed independently. We didn't do that in the second round. We are doing that again in the third round. So yes, there is a degree of replicability there, and we're actually having a look at the samples from, again, 2 independent eyes.
Sorry, just to clarify though, the actual gathering of said samples is done by whom?
Contractors on site, we have there's different samples being taken, either from the groundwater wells or the soil sampling. I don't have that detail at my fingertips, exactly what personnel on site did that, but I can make sure that we have that as an update for the panel.
So the personnel that you're referring to are NorthStar personnel that are gathering those samples? I just want to know who's doing the gathering.
I don't believe they're NorthStar, but that's probably something that NorthStar and Haley and Aldrich, I don't know who is physically the person on site, like literally grabbing the soil sample. So we split the sample, and then we have a look at it between 2 different labs. But in terms of whose hands are actually the ones, filling the required amount of the media, I don't have that information. Potentially NorthStar and Haley and Aldrich, when they present next, could provide that answer, and if not, I can check up for next time.
Okay, and just finally, who determines the actual sites where the material is gathered? Is that your decision?
That was the initial site investigation that occurred, where these 17 locations were identified. And so there is actually some additional sites that have been identified, and that's part of the additional work that Haley and Aldrich will be conducting to actually then provide the full risk assessment. So this was from the initial site assessment work, where we focused on these 17 areas of concern. That was the map that was up there, and I apologize, it was rather too small to see. Within the report, once we've reviewed it, it will be available online, and there are site locations and maps for each of these areas of concern and the detail of which samples were taken at each of these sites. But I'll definitely make sure that I provide to the panel information on who is physically actually grabbing that sample.
I have a question. On the stormwater permit, has a hearing been scheduled for that?
Not yet, no. but that's information that we can provide to the panel as well to make sure that we can send out to interested folks to make sure they're aware of when that 30-day comment period is.
But will there also, so in addition though to the posting, will there actually be a public hearing on the stormwater?
So there are two ways in which a public hearing can be scheduled. Either we as the department decide, given a certain permit that is required, but also a public hearing can be requested by any member of the public as well.
Because I think in communicating with Wyndham Regional Commission had requested a hearing, and I think your staff had said that that would suffice.
Excellent, then it will be in the record. So even though we have that in advance of when it goes on public notice.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions, or we'll move on to, okay?
My understanding is that the testing and evaluation of soils and waters is being conducted by a firm employed by NorthStar?
That is correct. They are taking the samples, and where there are actually situations where we have split samples, then it is analyzed by two independents. And so
the review of the reports is being reviewed once again by people that work for or under the auspices of the department?
Two sets, yes. There again, ATC, who's the technical contractor who has a lot of experience in this area, and by the department staff, my department staff.
So, okay, but is there anyone else that is conducting similar tests of similar soils and water that is not the employee of NorthStar?
So there is no independent third party. There's state oversight. There's our contractor who we've brought in to make sure that we have the right level of technical expertise, because it's not something the department does every day. And there is NorthStar and their contractor, Haley and Aldrich. So that's a level of oversight that has been in place.
So the current system allows NorthStar to hire a company to determine whether things are very contaminated or not so contaminated, and then we have independent researchers that look at the report but do not conduct actual studies themselves that are independent.
So this site follows the I rule, which is the I rule, which is the rule that controls the investigation, characterization, and remediation of any contaminated properties that we have in the state. So what that first requires is, whatever the responsible party is for the site, that there is a plan about how the site will be investigated. That plan is reviewed and approved. There is then the implementation of that plan with oversight by the department. And there is then a review of the results that are reported back by that. So that's the I rule process that contaminated properties anywhere in the state will follow. In this instance, what we have in addition to the department is ATC, the technical contractor, because of their expertise in this area. And what we also have had in the first round and will have in the third round is when the samples are taken, when we say a split sample, so essentially Haley and Aldrich takes half and ATC takes half. So the consultant working on behalf of NorthStar and the consultant working on behalf of the department in oversight then analyzes those samples.
Maybe I've been doing this too long, but with the previous owners, we did not take their studies at face value and replicated them, and the Department of Health was partly had some role in taking a look at that. And sometimes I digress, Mr. Chair, but when I was in the service and flew on helicopters, the people that inspected our helicopters that servicemen flew in were not under the control of the company commanders who were the directors of whether or not helicopters should fly or not. It was an independent group, not under the control of the owners or the commanders. It was an independent group, and who reported to people reported to individuals, unlike the commanders of the unit, whose evaluation was based on how many helicopters were ready for service. We had a separate backup. Do we have such a backup in this system?
I do believe that with the oversight from the department and the independent contractor ATC who we've hired, that we do have that.
They
NorthStar,
review the material, or they conduct separate and independent analysis of what's out there?
so when a sample is split, then that is independent analysis. And so the question that was also raised about who is actually taking, like literally grabbing that sample, I'll get back to that. But the firm Haley and Aldrich, who NorthStar has hired to do this, is a firm of good quality that the state works with in other areas as well. So, you know, I understand and appreciate the level of oversight that we all desire here. I do believe with the department and the technical contractor that the system that we have set up that has been functioning for the last couple of years is proving it is effective. If there is a desire, or should there have been a desire for yet a third party as opposed to the state and the contractor and NorthStar and their contractor, it's not impossible for us to reconsider at this point in time, but I unfortunately was not party to some of those discussions that probably occurred over the last 5 to 3 years to get us to this point.
Well, I thank you, and I won't take any more of panel's time to ask further questions, but I'm concerned. Okay, thank you.
The 17 sites that were identified, and after I speak, I think Corey Daniels also wants to say something. It's probably going to enlighten us on it completely. But how were those initial 17 sites determined? That was part of, you said, the initial site assessment, but who identified the sites where samples we don't know who actually took the samples from those sites, but how were the sites themselves determined in that initial assessment? Was it the department?
So with that, if Corey has some additional information, seeing he was on the ground at that point in time that I wasn't, in terms of what we're looking for when we identify where the sites are, it's kind of looking at activities that occurred in those places, and so looking to find where we think contamination might have occurred. So looking at the areas of greatest concern. And so that was the first 17. And I do want to be clear that there is additional work and evaluation that needs to go on between now and the full risk assessment report that is going to be due to us. It will probably be within a year, but it might take about that amount of time. So if I can allow Corey to kind of put in maybe some of the on-the-ground knowledge at the start of this process that I wasn't on the ground for.
Go ahead, Corey.
Thank you, Commissioner. I would add to the conversation multiple questions. First, addressing the query on the effectiveness of the initial testing for the intercept well test study. It was very promising. Where we are intercepting or plan to potentially intercept the water from the drawdown test we saw just to test the well for yield in 3 locations, we saw a nearly 50% reduction in intrusion to the turbine building during that period. Now, we only ran that for 24 hours during the well development, and it is unlikely that that number will remain the answer going forward. It could be better, it could stabilize and change, but it did prove effective and it would be valuable for us. So we are pursuing that. We are looking at that in terms of cost-benefit analysis. So that one question hopefully is helpful. With respect to the split sampling and the state's consultants on site, they've been on site multiple times. They follow the Haley and Aldrich folks around when they conduct the groundwater sampling. They've monitored the technique and performance of those samples in obtaining the split samples. So they are watching very closely when they do perform that. I will not say that it is their intention to be there for every single sample that is collected, but they have monitored the technique and operation of that performance, and they were involved in the collection of sampling, if not performing it themselves, standing directly next to the person conducting that work. So that independence leads all the way to the performance of sample collection. Does that help clarify that at all, Senator?
Okay, I'm gonna,
I'm satisfied with that answer, thank you.
so the next item on the agenda is other state agencies, and then we're gonna go to NorthStar, so Corey, you'll have plenty more time to address the questions that came up. Other state agencies.
Tony, if you could cue up the department's slides, please. I would ask the panel to indulge me. The counsel who works on this matter regularly could not join us tonight. She is the author of the slide presentation, so I will do my best to give her message, and if answers prove unsatisfactory, we'll get back to you with follow-up answers. So next slide, please. The number, that one right there. Okay. The department, as you know, has an ongoing role in this decommissioning process, but as you can see from the time split with the panel and the nature of the substance that Commissioner Bedecker has just shared with us, the focus here has shifted somewhat, and the on-the-ground substance right now is really a matter that the Agency of Natural Resources takes the lead on. So these will be 10,000-foot level remarks. The first slide just reiterates the department's role in the decommissioning oversight. It primarily focuses on two areas: financial review and technical review. The department has a consultant, 4 Points Group, for this review. They have the requisite skill set and technical expertise to be looking at the financial and technical questions. In conducting the financial review, the department looks at the financial performance of the project, including cash flow. The department also analyzes the financial health of NorthStar and its affiliates. And this is relevant to ensuring that we have continuing viability for the financial assurances that were negotiated as part of the Memorandum of Understanding in Docket 8880. In conducting its technical review, the department is confirming that the work that's being performed is reasonable and consistent with the Nuclear Decommissioning Trust withdrawals that NorthStar sends our way regularly. The department also evaluates the project to identify risks or concerns that could challenge the successful completion of the project. Next slide, please. Since the last meeting of the panel, the department and its consultants have been meeting regularly with NorthStar and communicating regularly with them and their technical and legal staff to fine-tune the reporting and information exchange that is at the heart of this decommissioning process that we are maintaining and supervising. The department and its consultants met with several members of NorthStar staff in late July and conducted a site visit. A second site visit was conducted in September by 4 Points Group, our consultants, who will continue to visit the site regularly. And of course, our nuclear engineer, Tony Lashinsky, remains on site regularly as well. The department has streamlined certain aspects of administering the MOU. For example, the agency and NorthStar have synchronized disclosure and discussion of the monthly summary of expenditures required under the MOU with the request for disbursements from the Site Restoration Trust. A call is held to discuss these items, generally around the 15th of each month. NorthStar is also providing end-of-month balances for the Nuclear Decommissioning and Site Restoration Trusts, as you'll see at the end of the presentation. The department's also working on reconfiguring the website to produce or to provide additional information to make it more accessible to the public and user-friendly, I guess is the word I'm looking for. Next slide, please. This slide here shows you what work is in progress at the site. The Agency of Natural Resources, meaning Commissioner Bedecker, has already discussed in some detail the site characterization. Another main item to note is the last bullet about the reactor vessel segmentation. This is being performed by Orano, a company that has previously addressed this panel at length and explained its operations. Next slide, please. In case anybody is concerned that I'm moving too quickly, these slides will also be available on the website for your review at your leisure. This is a slide that depicts the technical updates so far. As of this meeting, we've received no NRC violation notices after the NorthStar transition. The site preparations for decommissioning are complete or underway. Non-critical structures have been removed to facilitate future work. The reactor vessel project is underway, and there's about 18 months remaining. And as far as we can tell, no red flags to date, and no warning signs. It probably should go without saying, but of course we're keeping our eyes open for such red flags and warning signs. That's the nature of supervision. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, NorthStar is providing the monthly balances of the Nuclear Decommissioning Trust and the Site Restoration Trust. Those monthly balances are shown here. As you can see, as of September 30 of this year, the Decommissioning Trust balance was approximately $456 million, and the Site Restoration Trust balance approximately $63 million. And the next two slides very quickly will show the monthly withdrawals from each fund. I don't mean quickly as in you shouldn't study them, but rather in the interest of conserving time here. Where are we at this point? Is that, I'm sorry, Tony, I can't tell. Is that slide?
That's the...
Okay, so you're all the way at 8, right? Okay, very good. So I've crossed the finish line and I didn't even know it. Very good. Does the panel have questions at this point?
Any questions for the commissioner?
What kinds of expenditures come out of the Site Restoration Trust as opposed to the Nuclear Decommissioning Trust? I mean, what differentiates the expenditures from the two accounts?
Sorry, the Nuclear Decommissioning Trust and did you say Site Restoration?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So the Site Restoration Trust is specifically reserved for the rehabilitation is the word I'm going to use, but it goes to the characteristics of the site per se, as opposed to the infrastructure of the generation plant and its fuel and the like. Does that help you?
Like, for instance?
Yeah. I'm going to ask Tony to see if you could shed a little light on the specific nature of the activities. And if not, I think Mr. Daniels could probably tell you a little more about the itemization. I can assure you that we have documents at my office that we look at. I'm just not that person, so and that's where counsel could be helpful, but is not here tonight. Tony, can you shed some light on this?
Is this working?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
It is. You just need to project into it.
Okay. Okay. Now, unfortunately, I'm not involved on that level of detail. Which is coming out of which fund. I'm following mostly the activities that would be coming out of the Nuclear Decommissioning Trust, simply because I'm more concerned with the radiological cleanup as opposed to the hazmat cleanup, which is ANR and DEC. So hopefully, I don't know, maybe David or Corey can address that a little further.
Any other questions? We will get you an answer on that.
Yeah. For instance, the cost of the DEC and analysis of the non-radiological, where's that coming from?
Good question.
Is that coming from the site restoration? I'm just not clear.
Timothy Corey had his hand up if you don't want to take that one.
So I'll go ahead and feed into this a little, and without going into great detail, I mean, there's really only one authorized agency here to speak to this directly, and that would be the state monitoring this. I will share with you, the Nuclear Decommissioning Trust Fund is generally reserved for the dismantlement of the power plant proper and the radiological decontamination of the site. The SRT is more with the characterization, remediation, and preparation of the site to be restored to the standards that were arranged in the MOU with the state and the town. Does that help? So the characterization and the sampling that Alien Aldrich's are doing is SRT funding. Taking apart the reactor vessel and cutting up the head is NDT funding. That's kind of a simple delineation.
Do we have any other agency reports, Bill, or anyone?
So yeah, this is Bill Irwin from the Department of Health. The state agencies meet monthly to review all of the activities that are ongoing at the site. That would be the Public Service Department, the Department of Environmental Conservation, Attorney General's office, and we are, from the Department of Health, particularly at this point in time, especially looking at all of the documents that are being generated by Haley and Aldridge or by NorthStar for asbestos-containing material remediation, because that's the primary role of the Department of Health at this stage of decommissioning. There are a number of other activities that we engage in or will engage in over the course of time that are more related to radiological issues. The one that we engage in constantly at this time is to monitor shipments of radioactive waste from the facility. The NorthStar contractors have an excellent process for providing the department with reports as to the number of rail cars, the containers of those rail cars, and the radioactivity in those rail cars, as well as their destination. And to some degree, we get from that destination a sense of what kind of treatment is going to be likely occurring at the final destination for disposal. And that is something that we track along with review of all of the literally thousands of pages of documents that are being generated at this stage of the game for the planning of decommissioning and site restoration. And I can take any questions if anybody has those.
Any questions for Dr. Irwin? Oh. Any questions for Dr. Irwin?
I have a question. Has there ever been a radiological assessment of the Vernon Elementary School?
So we actually continuously monitor the conditions at the Vernon Elementary School and have since 1972. We have active radiation detector that will alarm if there are radiation levels that exceed background by some number of times. We also have dosimeters, which are passive devices like I wear, that integrate the dose over a calendar quarter, and we change those every 3 months and report on that. We also have an air sampler outside of the Vernon Elementary School, and we replace the cartridges and analyze the samples at the laboratory, as we have for decades. And then we are collecting water from the school itself, as well as numerous other locations in Vernon and in Windham County. So the results of our laboratory analysis are published annually, and you can look at all of those reports, including the most recent reports.
Okay, I'm going to move us on to, so just for those watching at home, I've been allowing questions around each of the topics as opposed to waiting until after everybody's presented to allow Q&A, so hopefully we'll be able to find some time. Next up is NorthStar's update on the Vermont Yankee decommissioning activities. One other thing I'm just going to note, again for those watching at home, it's raining. We need rain, but the timing is a little unfortunate. So in here, the rain is actually fairly loud on the roof. So just everybody, if you just speak up as best you can, and if you need something else repeated, don't be shy, because it's a little we have a little bit of white noise going on in here.
All right, good evening. Again, I'm Corey Daniels. I'm the manager for the spent fuel storage installation, and have been at Vermont Yankee for about 23 years now. This update is to show you the work that we have done since the last update. So Tony, if you just step through the next slide, please. Just a reminder that our priorities at the site start with safety. We have a target of 0 accidents, and we're going to talk about the performance a little later in the deck. Next slide. If you recall, at the last NDCAP, We had this schedule up on the board. It's a macro and shows the major activities. I know it's very small on the board, but again, these will be made available as well to review. It pretty much describes that the dry fuel storage was put in, the fuel was put in dry storage up through August of 2018, and we're working on large component removal and vessel disassembly. And then the spent fuel management will be the bottom bar in tan, and that shows through 2026 and then on until the Department of Energy executes on removing the fuel from the site. Next slide. So this is an updated macro schedule with a little more granularity. While we were performing the work specific to the reactor vessel segmentation and removal, we also look at the major components that can come out. And part of the resource optimization is to use the tooling, equipment, and people that we have on site to go after the big components inside the structures. We're going to show you some photographs of the work we've done in the past 4 months or so that support that. But the critical path remains the reactor vessel segmentation work, and that'll go on as we described for approximately 18 months. In the meantime, we'll work on the turbine components and some of the other larger structures. Next slide. As far as performance goes, on site, the NorthStar staff has performed for 10 months without a lost time accident. Over 220,000 hours logged working at the site. Our regulatory performance, as you mentioned, we've had 0 cited violations or non-cited violations. We've conducted several QA audits and had multiple benchmarks by peers. We've also hosted a number of international energy agencies and regulatory bodies to come see the way we're doing our decommissioning work and to provide them some insight on things that we know work for us. Production overall, we are on track, and it's a long project and it's a big project. We got out to a little bit of a slow start. The transaction closure date was delayed slightly, and some of the work that we would have preferred to have been done prior to acquiring the site, mostly cleaning out the spent fuel pool and setting up the refuel floor to support the vessel work. We had to take that on first thing, so we're catching up a little bit from that. But overall, with the other activities and the work we're doing to utilize the resources, we're well into the decommissioning, and we feel our performance and targets to date are meeting expectations. Next slide. All right, so some of the major targets of opportunity. While they're working in the reactor building, we're also working our way down in the turbine building. Ultimately, what that looks like is we have a team that works to remove all the insulation, perform abatement of asbestos-containing materials and other non-radiological hazards, and then we start dismantling the large components to empty that building out. That starts with removing the turbine and the generator. You can see a very large component of the turbine shroud being removed and set on cribbing in this photo. What you can't really make out in this photo is there is a machine with a large diamond wire saw that is cutting that component in half. Next slide. So that is 1/2 of that component, and it has been cut, and it is then had a fixative applied to it, so any loose surface contamination is well preserved, and it is in a condition now where it can be put into a large gondola rail car covered with a tarp, placarded, and sent to Texas. Next slide. And Tony, most of the titles for these speak for themselves, so without a lot of narrative, I'll probably have you step through these. I think I have about a dozen photos of turbine component removals. So that shows a large upper bearing casing that has been cut in half. That was one piece in the photo previously, and then it's segmented for this photo. Next slide. These are the large steam pipes that feed the turbine from the reactor. These also have been cut and removed. Next slide. This is the turbine diaphragms, the casings that go directly around the blading. That's what you see after you pull the casings off. Those are being removed as well to expose the turbine shaft and blading. Next slide. You can see one of the large low pressure turbine blades on the end there with the workers, and that is effectively looking from north to south down the entire length of the turbine deck. The generator's at the other end of that, and that is the turbine itself. Next slide. So again, a side view of the high and low pressure turbine blading. Next slide. So the turbine is normally designed to come apart in large pieces, be removed and then reassembled. I'll say we're doing it a little quicker this time. It's not an outage. We don't have to turn it back on and have it work. So we are basically cutting it into pieces. And these are pretty large components. That shaft, I believe, is 24 inches in diameter. That coupling, I think that piece there weighed about 7,000 or 8,000 pounds alone. And you can see the shaft running vertically behind it, and you can see another large coupling that was cut in the background. Next slide. So this kind of shows the south end of the turbine deck where the staging area is, where we use a large crane. There are custom-made racks, and all those components have been set and with fixative applied, and they're ready and staged to be loaded into gondola cars and shipped. On the very right-hand side of the screen, you can actually see the corner of a gondola car, and you can see the bay where the railroad tracks come into the turbine building. What you can't see is the overhead crane that picks the equipment up and sets it down in there. Next slide. So some additional packaging operations happen inside of our large big top tent structure. This allows for effective use of the real estate on the site, which is limited. We can't do all the work in one location, so we'll bring some of the equipment out here to do the final packaging and preparations for shipment. Next slide. Again, it just kind of gives you a scale for the size of the structure. And this is a temporary structure, but we put it up and it will remain up for a good part of the decommissioning. There are actually small office trailers on each side that are heated and air conditioned as well, so we can do more than just the physical work. We can also process the paperwork and manifesting and other office activities that go with this work. Next slide. Additionally, we found we have some constraints with the amount of rail that was on the site, and while we did the major improvements on the south end of the site and added that location where that large tent structure was, we realized that we could be even more effective if we had a little more real estate. We're also on a fairly small rail system, and the ability to get train engines to us in rapid fashion is also constrained. So we added a section of rail to give us an additional spur so we can park cars both loaded and unloaded to improve our turnaround time. Next slide. This is just a picture of some of the cars that we use to give you an idea of the scale of the materials as they're leaving the site. Next slide. The last of the fuel racks was packaged up and sent away this week. These are custom fabricated containers that go inside of the gondolas. They're fabricated in the United States. They meet all of the requirements for Department of Transportation per 10 CFR 49. And the high-sided gondola, you can see there's some additional metal plates welded in for shielding to ensure that the requirements are met for the radiological conditions associated with the materials as they go down the rails. Next slide. In addition to the sacks and other equipment that we have spec built, we modified the gondola cars on site as needed. We have engineering on site to provide any required calculations and pedigree for that equipment, and we've had the railroad inspectors multiple times to see our operation and challenge all the aspects of the packaging, shipment, manifesting, and control of the materials with our contractors. Next slide. You can see the about 23,000 gallon liquid tanker truck to the left and another large gondola car. Those pictures are basically taken right out my office window across the lawn. Next slide. Those are pieces of the turbine casing being moved on the site. They don't go to Texas quite like that. They will get covered and placarded, but they were just being relocated so they could be packaged and processed for shipment. Next slide. Last presentation, we talked quite a bit about reactor vessel segmentation. We talked about the construction of the reactor itself and the vessel internals, how much it weighs, how big it is, the general order, which is working your way from top to bottom. I'm happy to report the reactor containment head and the reactor vessel head are gone. The steam dryer's been removed and segmented and packaged. It's being shipped out, and the separator, which is next, is basically ready to go. Once we change the conditions on the refill floor, we're going to have to flood up, and the rest of the work will then happen underwater for the cutting operations. Next slide. So this slide's a little bit busy. It shows a 3D rendering of the reactor vessel and all its parts, and then it shows a number of the operations that were in progress on the refill floor to get those large components moved and cut up and segmented and packaged. Tony, if you can attempt to run that video. We have a small video to show you that kind of helps you put some scale to what the refill floor looks like in operation.
Let me move it over here. Let's think of it, Mom.
And if you can, there is the ability to, there you go. So we're looking at the reactor vessel cavity. To the left is the spent fuel pool. To the right is the dryer separator pit. All those are connected together. Those were the shield plugs that used to live on top of the reactor when it was in operation. From the last presentation, we talked about the custom boxes specifically designed for packaging large components of the vessel. The geometry, shielding, materials, all custom spec built for this process. Even the orientation and placement of those pieces inside of those boxes help with the shielding and all the engineering that goes into ensuring that they meet the weight requirements for the rail, the radiological constraints for shipment, and the packaging requirements by the CFRs. Thank you, Tony. You'll probably want to pause that. It's because I've seen some interesting second things show up on YouTube. So again, we wanted to demonstrate in the 10 months since ownership that a lot of work is happening at the site, and it's not just the critical path activities, it's us optimizing our resources and using every available opportunity to remove the equipment and package and get it out of here so we can meet our deadlines and targets. Again, along with those custom boxes and all the work that goes into orienting the components in, we also apply a specialized grout, low density concrete to the inside of the boxes to stabilize it and provide shielding. It's a special mix, and we work with the local vendor here to get it just right so the weight's not too high and it still meets the requirements for the stability and provides some shielding and holds the equipment still while it's traveling down the rail. You can see a small heap of filter that's actually a ventilation exhaust. And on the next slide, on the other side of that wall is a concrete truck and a pump that allows an aeration mixture to put the concrete in so we can perform that activity outdoors. Next slide. Some of these boxes weigh 60,000 pounds before we put anything in them when they're loaded. Some of them are over 250,000 pounds. We have some limitations on the rail in this part of the country, but overall they're heavy enough that it requires 2 cranes to lift them. We have a Gold Offer, a specialized multi-wheel vehicle with a remote pennant operation. We can move it around on site and then transfer it onto the rail cars. Next slide. And that's the first custom box leaving the site. Additionally, on the last presentation, we talked about a horizontal transfer system. This is specially designed by TN, and it allows us also to put materials that have a high degree of dose component to them into a storage vault and stage them for transportation. We can generate material faster than we can get it off the site by rail. So this gives us a place to put it where we know it's safe, secure, and it's shielded until we can get it onto the cars and out. Next slide. Just another representation of the RT100 cast, which is one of the specialty casts. Next slide. And this is what they look like when they're in the cradle, ready for rail shipment. And these casts are actually rated to even ship spent nuclear fuel as well. And this is what some of the material will leave the site in. Next slide. Everyone is likely aware that we did dismantle the cooling towers. This is what they look like back in May. Next slide. And we demolished one on the 11th of July and the other on the 22nd. You can see 2 large excavators pulling it down, and then over the course of the remainder of the summer, we removed all the material. And just one more angle of it. Go ahead, Tony, next slide. So in the far distance, you can barely make out the deep basin for the west tower. That's still there. We haven't dispositioned that yet at this time, but we have reseeded the area, and all the material is now gone. So that pretty much covers the bulk of the activities that we've been working on at the site. If there are any questions now.
Any questions? Okay, thank you. So next we've got Congressional Delegation update on decommissioning related legislation. Haley, yeah, come on up, Haley. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay? Great. Thank you for having me here tonight. My name is Haley Perro, and I do outreach on energy and environmental issues for Senator Sanders. I know that my colleagues in Senator Leahy's office and Congressman Welch's office had hoped to be here, and they may join at a later date for an update. First, I just wanted to remind you about Bernie's main bill on nuclear decommissioning, the Nuclear Plant Decommissioning Act. He's reintroduced it a number of times, most recently in 2018, and Congressman Welch is the lead co-sponsor in the House. As you probably recall, that would give states a meaningful role in the development and approval of the reactor shutdown plan and also for post-shutdown license transfers, as we saw here in Vermont. Typically, that bill has been reintroduced as a package with Senator Markey's Dry Cask Storage Act and also Senator Boxer and now Senator Harris's Safe and Secure Decommissioning Act, which deals with emergency preparedness and security waivers. Also, you know recently that the NEMA Act passed. That was the Nuclear Energy and Innovation Modernization Act. That became law in January of this year, and that is what spurred on the public meeting that was held here in September and other meetings across the country to learn about best practices for decommissioning panels. Quick update on rulemaking, which you also probably recall, starting back in 2014, the NRC proposed rulemaking to address the regulatory framework specific to decommissioning and to reduce the number of exemptions, among other things. The proposed rule, it's sort of a moving target, is scheduled to be signed at the beginning of next year, and the final rule, the target date for that to be signed, is about a year from now. I apologize, actually October 2021. Senator Sanders, along with some of his Senate colleagues, had signed onto a letter about rulemaking, raising some of the concerns that the state shared. And we can continue to be engaged in that if and when we hear further from the panel or others about concerns. Moving on to key bills, many of which are focused on storage. As you know, storage, long-term storage, and interim storage continue to be a huge problem. DOE is responsible for a repository, the NRC would license, Yucca Mountain has been identified, the state of Nevada strongly opposes that project. The Obama administration halted work on Yucca, established the Blue Ribbon Commission in 2012, and did provide some recommendations, including a new single-purpose organization to be given the authority and the resources to develop a permanent repository. It also mentioned consolidated storage, and it also talked about a consent-based process. As I said, several bills have been introduced in this Congress. One that's been reintroduced is from Senator Murkowski, who is the chair of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee in the Senate. She has reintroduced the Nuclear Waste Administration Act. That would implement a number of the Blue Ribbon Commission's recommendations, including establishing a nuclear waste administration. It would also put in place some pilot programs for priority waste and non-priority waste. And at the same time, it also mandates that the Nuclear Waste Administration would need to move forward with a permanent repository. It would tie short-term priority waste and non-priority waste to developing something like a Yucca Mountain. We've also seen the House bill, the Nuclear Waste Policy Amendments Act of 2019, reintroduced. There's no Senate companion yet, but as you might recall, that bill would authorize and give DOE's explicit authorization to enter into contracts with non-federal interim storage site facilities when there's local consent. As you probably also know, there has already been 2 proposed private sector waste storage sites, one in New Mexico and one in Texas. And other nuclear waste bills include 2 from senators in Nevada who continue to have concerns about Yucca Mountain or other sites in their state. One is the Nuclear Waste Informed Consent Act, which would require that DOE only spend money to develop a site if there's local consent. And then a bill focused on a study to see what jobs could be created for an alternate use of Yucca Mountain. Another bill that I know has been on this panel's mind is the Stranded Act, which comes from Senator Duckworth and Senator Sanders is a co-sponsor of. That has been reintroduced, and that would authorize DOE to issue grants to communities with closed nuclear power plants that are storing the fuel right on site. It'd be $15 for each kilogram of stored nuclear waste. It also establishes a prize competition to develop alternative activities at closed reactor sites, and it creates a task force to help identify other funding opportunities for affected communities. Lastly, the Department of Energy, Senator Duckworth has introduced the Department of Energy and Nuclear Regulatory Commission Whistleblower Protection Act. All these bills are in Senate committees now, or House committees where appropriate, but none have moved out of committee. So probably the most action that we've seen at the congressional level has been through appropriations. The Senate has passed both its energy and water and its criminal justice and science appropriation bills out of the Senate Appropriations Committee, but they have not passed the full Senate. The House has moved further forward on that. Trump in his FY20 budget did include funds to restart Yucca Mountain. The House's bill did not provide these funds. However, it did include $25 million within DOE's existing nuclear energy program for interim storage activities. The Senate similarly did not provide specific funding for Yucca, and again, that bill has not passed the full Senate, but it did include $10 million for DOE to contract for spent fuel management, including the use of private consolidated interim spent fuel storage facilities. It calls for a pilot program similar to what we saw last year. However, these bills, appropriations bills, will need to be conferenced, so it's unclear whether any of these provisions or report language will be maintained. In the other funding bill, the Senate has some report language for assistance to nuclear power plants and their communities. It includes $5 million to EDA for early strategic planning and economic development projects. The House has something similar in their version. They have $17 million. They worked without knowing kind of the spending levels that would be allowed. So we think that the Senate version is probably more realistic to pass if that even is included in conference. And I'm happy to send any and all of this information electronically if you want to look at the bill text of any of these bills. If you have any feedback, please feel free to give it to me. Or if you have any bills that you want our office to be looking at, please let me know. Thank you.
Any questions for Haley?
Regarding the substance of Senator Sanders' Nuclear Plant Decommissioning Act, which would give states more meaningful input into decommissioning, is there any provision in that act regarding the final disposition of properties? Like, in other words, we have an agreement with NorthStar to return the site to a 10 millirem cleanup standard, which is far below the federal standard. Does that bill do anything to try to enforce the state's ability to enforce a standard like that? I know what the MOU says in our case, but I'm just wondering if there's anything like that in the
I don't believe so. I'd be happy to check, but it mostly provides an opportunity for input at the local level and the state level, and provides an expedited process if there is that state support for either the shutdown plan or for the license transfer. But I'd be happy to follow up and see if that's something that's in there or something that we could include in future versions of the bill.
And the 10 million that's in the appropriations bill for a pilot interim consolidated storage facility, is that for the waste control specialist facility? Do you know? Is that the NorthStar partner facility?
As far as I know, the report language does not name, any particular or company that would be doing that, and its report language, it's also not, legally binding. It just offers $10 million or suggests $10 million for DOE to contract, but it does not say, who would be doing that work.
So, is it your understanding, as per existing law right now, that having a private company operate an interim storage facility is currently illegal?
I think there's certainly legal debate about that, so I don't want to speak definitively on that. I know it's something that the House bill has looked to clarify and explicitly authorize that it's allowed. I believe that WCS believes what they're doing is legal, so I can't say for certain.
Does anybody else have a question? Okay, thank you. So now, so we've had panel Q&A on individually. Now, does the public have any questions for any of the presenters who've presented thus far? Going once, going twice. Okay, why don't we take a 5-minute break. We will reconvene at 7:25. So we have a new item on the agenda, which is early general public comments for people unable to stay for the end of the meeting. So does anybody who's not able to stay for the end of the meeting want to make a public comment? Okay, thank you. So next up is Vermont NDCAP and Submittal to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, summarizing the history of the panel. This is something that was drafted by Tony. I'm trying to remember, it was just a few weeks ago, but for the life of me, I'm trying to remember, did we give a draft to the NRC, or I know I drew from it in my comments to the NRC, but remind me again what we did with the document itself.
We haven't submitted it yet to the NRC, but you covered the major points in the document rather thoroughly. Now, based on that meeting, however, a couple of comments that were made there, I did go back and make a couple of minor changes to the document. The biggest one was that my understanding was the predecessor of NDCAP, VSNAP, started when Entergy purchased the plant. That was based on some stuff that I apparently misread. With a comment that was received at the NEMA meeting and a little more digging, I discovered that VSNAP was much older than that. So I just simply stated that VSNAP has, well, I didn't give a date. As best I can tell right now, it was founded roughly 1984, but I don't have exact info on that. So I threw that in, that that it existed for some time, and I also clarified a little bit. We described who had served on the panel, not people by name, but by position. So there are a couple of places where the positions weren't very clear, so I gave some clarification to those. In the handout that the panelists received, there are identifiers of what has changed. And there was one last item, and bear with me as I dig it out here. Of course, in the paper is fighting back. But the last item that I wanted to add, and this is entirely up to the panel on whether it goes in. The very last item in the document, this is under Vermont NDCAP practices of potential interest to the NRC. I've added an item that says multiple public comment periods are typically included throughout an NDCAP meeting. Several of these comment periods will be for comments or questions on specific meeting agenda items. And then towards the end of the meeting, we have a general public comment period. There's an additional bullet item that I don't think anyone has seen prior to these being distributed earlier, well, actually late last week, if I remember correctly.
Thank you, Tony. Just as a reminder for folk, what this is about was providing basically a history summary to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission about how we were organized, how we function. I'll just ask, and we saw this, I think, didn't we see this at our meeting did we see this at our last meeting? I'm trying to remember.
I made it available after the last meeting. We discussed it some at the May meeting, and I distributed it, I want to say it was like, I don't know, sometime in June or July. We did, it is available, and it has been available for some time on the NDCAP website as well.
Okay. So let me ask, does anybody have any opposition to NDCAP submitting this to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission?
Can you repeat that question, please?
Does anyone have any opposition to NDCAP submitting this to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission? To the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission.
Does anybody have an objection to submitting the changes proposed in NDCAP to the NRC? Is that the question?
This is not a change to NDCAP. This is our history.
Okay.
You may be looking at the wrong document.
I am certainly looking at the wrong document.
Okay. This is called the Establishment and Short History of the Vermont Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel. And this is in response to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's inquiry into best practices for for citizen advisory panels. And so what we had discussed providing at the last meeting was a summary of how the panel was formed, how we operate, and what we've done to date.
Does the history of VSNAP include the recommendations that VSNAP made in its official capacity, such as not approving the uprate of Vermont Yankee until further information had been provided.
So this is about specifically citizens advisory panels. This didn't cover VSNAP, and I don't know that this panel necessarily has the ability to get into VSNAP, but we can talk
So
about
it doesn't
that.
include VSNAP's vote not to permit the uprate, and it doesn't include VSNAP's
It simply
vote in
mentions that.
history not to include the extension of the Vermont Yankee contract until it was established of who would be left holding the bag if Vermont Yankee closed prior to its date without any contributions to the decommissioning fund that participated in leaving us in the dilemma we're in today. The history doesn't include that?
This is not about VSNAP. This is about, so the only reference to VSNAP is that NDCAP replaced VSNAP.
It did.
Right.
And the composition, once Vermont Yankee closed, the emphasis was that the people that lived in the immediate area should be consulted on what was going to happen next because they were the most likely to be impacted, and that NDCAP was dominated by people from this county. In fact, this body voted unanimously to replace me on this panel, and to replace me with a representative or senator from this Vernon Brattleboro area, and because that's what this panel represented, the Vernon Brattleboro area.
So the question is, does anybody have any opposition to us submitting this to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission?
The history. Well, I would hope that you would update it and remind the NRC that the panel that you are giving history of had voted several times not to permit what has taken place. But I'm just one member, and I'm not from this area.
So I'm going to move. So can I get a motion to do it? Yes, go ahead, Josh.
Chris, I'd like to make a motion to accept the establishment and short history of Vermont Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel as written here.
Thank you. Do we have a second?
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor? We have to do a roll call vote. Representative Sibilia.
Yes.
Senator McDonald.
No.
Mr. Leach.
Aye.
Mr. Jordan.
Yes.
Mr. Unruh.
Aye.
Mr. Root.
Yes.
Ms. Weinman.
Abstain.
Mr. Campany, aye. Commissioner Tierney.
Aye.
Commissioner Bodecker.
Aye.
Mr. Irwin.
Here, aye.
Mr. Daniels.
Abstain.
Mr. Pearson.
Aye.
Mr. Gustafson.
Aye.
Okay, with that, it passes. This will be submitted to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Okay, the next item on the agenda are proposed changes to the panel composition and enabling statute for panel discussion. Now, what I would suggest is we've got a lot of material here to cover, and I don't expect us to, I mean, maybe we will reach resolution tonight. Maybe we won't. My thinking was that this would be the very beginning of the conversation, that this may require discussion over a series of meetings, so we don't have to reach resolution tonight. This layout is a little challenging as far as like having a discussion with one another. But what I would ask folk to do is to certainly engage, offer their opinions, but please don't dominate the conversation. I'm going to be trying to call upon people to raise their hands, and those of you who are a little shy may see if you have comments as well. But the point here was now that we are in the life cycle of the Vermont Yankee Nuclear Power Station, now that it's going through decommissioning and the ownership has been transferred, that the goal, what the nuclear panel, what NDCAP agreed to do was to revisit the enabling legislation and the composition of the panel to see what, if anything, needs to change now that we have roadmap going forward. If you recall, when NDCAP was first formed, I think the assumption was that it was going to be in safe store for potentially 60 years. And now we're on a very different trajectory. There is a board order that lays out the process before us. It also includes specific reporting requirements. So we need to figure out how NDCAP, as it's been structured, how it comports with all of that. And if there's any changes that we feel would make sense going forward. And I would say everything is on the table. The Issues Committee met to really kind of not so much make recommendations. Well, there are some recommendations, specific things like changing Vermont Yankee Nuclear Power Station because it's no longer a power station. So there are some very specific recommendations, but I think the purpose was more to raise a set of questions for the panel to discuss. So that's the introduction. In your packet, there was, and we can talk about how you want to proceed, but there are a few things. One is, Corey took a stab at drafting proposed revisions to the charter and also proposed in the language of the proposed statute, and that was in your packet. And also Tony had sent around a document titled Potential Vermont NDCAP Changes Identified at July 2019 Issues Committee Meeting. And it's not really just changes. I would characterize it more as topics for discussion. So there may be some recommendations here, but really it's more topics for discussion. Obviously, nothing's been decided, and this could be a bit like eating an elephant. And of course, the best way to do that is one bite at a time. Does anybody have a preference about how we go through this? Senator?
My how we should go through it, I think we need to establish what the need is for both this community and for the state as we go forward. And I say that because VSNAP was a state panel on managing or giving advice to nuclear activities. And when the plant closed, it was the function of VSNAP vis-a-vis Vermont Yankee no longer worked. The plant was closed, and what was paramount was establishing a panel like this one to take a look at how the local community would be impacted, what it would recommend, how it would survive this big economic change. And now in place, there is an agreement. And the agreement needs to be policed. And it needs to be policed by a panel which is not loyal to this community. It needs to be loyal to the ratepayers of the state and those who may be on the hook if things don't work out in this community where this panel has done the best job it could to protect its local towns. But it's now a state issue again. And the dilemma of any subsequent panel is they have to worry about two things. One is NorthStar is running out of money and nothing's happening. Or, boy, NorthStar is getting everything done and they're going to come in under a budget and there is no problem. Those are the extremes. And if NorthStar runs out of money, and there's a point at which the decommissioning fund is expended or half expended, and no one has spoken up to point out that dilemma, The rest of the state is affected because they're going to have to pay for it. And we still do not have an answer from the NRC that in the event that the state, unfortunate event, would be saddled with any shortfall, whether it is Vermont ratepayers that would pay for it, or, as in the case of Maine Yankee, the ratepayers from the several states that invested in this plant, would they be obliged to pay for it? And until that question is answered, we're going to be a neverland.
Okay,
And
so I'd like to just
so
do
I
it.
would,
I'd like
I would suggest that we ask ourselves what the task is to be performed and not permit ourselves to have too parochial a panel. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Okay, so I'm just going to do it just to remind folk, and I'm reading here from I'm looking at the document that Corey provided. It's it says the Vermont statutes online, these statutes, and then he has modified it. Last updated November 2018. If we look on, there's no page numbers. So if folk look at, let's see, 1, 2, the third page. There's an item in blue. It says Title 18 Health, Chapter 34, Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel. Everybody kind of find that in the hymnal? Okay. So I just to go over what the statute originally said, and Corey, the blue underlined represents added language, right? The blue strike through represents the original language. So I'm going to look at the original language first, not the changes, just to get us all up to speed with what the original charge for NDCAP was as established by the legislature. So it says the panel shall serve in an advisory capacity only and shall not have authority to direct decommissioning of the Vermont VYMPS. The duties of the panel shall be to hold a minimum of 4 public meetings each year for the purpose of discussing issues relating to the decommissioning of the VYMPS. The panel may hold additional meetings. 2, to advise the governor, the General Assembly, the agencies of the state, and the public on issues related to the decommissioning of the VYMPS, with a written report being provided annually to the governor and to the energy committees of the General Assembly. The provisions of 2 VSA Section 20D, expiration of reports, shall not apply to this report. 3, to serve as a conduit for public information and education on and to encourage community involvement in matters related to the decommissioning of the Vermont VYMPS, and to receive written reports and presentations on the decommissioning of the station at its regular meetings. 4, to periodically receive reports on the decommissioning trust fund and other funds associated with decommissioning of or site restoration at VYMPS, including fund balances, expenditures made, and reimbursements received. And 5, to receive reports regarding the decommissioning plans for the VYMPS, including any site assessments and post-shutdown decommissioning assessment reports, provide a forum for receiving public comment on these plans and reports, and provide comment on these plans and reports as the panel may consider appropriate to state agencies and the owner of the VYMPS in an annual report described in subdivision 2 of this section. And I'm not going to read all the section salad down here at the bottom. So that was the original purpose. The senator has proposed a bit of a different approach.
Senators proposed that we establish an approach that we think would be useful and beneficial.
So I guess it would be helpful for me to know to what extent does the original charge, and I'm just trying to facilitate the conversation, to what extent does the original charge provide, what was your term, Senator, that you just used? Useful and what?
And beneficial to the state as we, as oversight is conducted to see whether or not the decommissioning is operating as this panel believed it would operate when this panel endorsed the current arrangement?
This panel didn't endorse the current arrangement, so so I would refer everybody back to the original duties as defined in statute. To what extent do folk feel like this charge is still relevant?
Well, Mr. Chair.
Let's look over here from
No,
somebody else.
Mr. Chair, that's a perfectly reasonable thing to ask this panel whether it thinks it's still relevant. This panel didn't create itself. This panel was created by the state because it thought it was very important at the time to have local communities deeply involved in a solution to the economic development that they were facing. I would suggest that the state now might be more interested in seeing that the solution that was crafted has some independent oversight, which is addressed by people from throughout the entire state. And I would ask the gentleman who updated, thank you, the VSNAP panel's history. Did you include the membership of that panel and who represented was represented on VSNAP?
Bear in mind, just going back to, I assume you're going back to the brief history of NDCAP. The only mention of VSNAP in there was that NDCAP was put in place of VSNAP. We did not discuss history at all, simply because the need for, or the desire for the short history being submitted to the NRC was discussing decommissioning panels. And so I felt it was important to note that there was a previous panel, but admittedly, I don't have extended history of that. You know, I was not here at the time.
Thanks, Tony. Josh, did you have your hand up?
Why we're going back to what we just approved is beyond me, so I'd like to move forward with the duties of the panel. As this has been changed in the blue, I believe this is still the direction of the panel, is to encourage community involvement and understanding of what's going on at the Vermont Yankee site. It's kind of a plain and simple direction of what we have to do, and I don't feel that that's changed at all or will change throughout the entire use of this panel.
Representative Sibilia.
I have reviewed all of these. I don't have too many questions. The one that did stick out for me was around the removal of the Secretary of Commerce and Community Development or designee. Can someone explain to me the thinking there?
So I know that was requested specifically by the Secretary of Commerce because one of the issues is the charge of the panel was never to address the economic and socioeconomic impacts. In fact, it was always told to me when this panel was first created, they specifically did not want the panel to talk about that. Now that we're in the decommissioning, the Secretary of Commerce had asked that they no longer would be required to have a representative, that they would be happy. And this is the, I will say now, the now former Secretary of Commerce, that they would be happy to engage in any way the panel would like them to, but that typically, like even when in the agency reports and other things that were going on, they typically didn't feel like they had a role. It was primarily the Department of Environmental Conservation, Public Service Department, Department of Health.
Okay, I would like to make the case for either the retention of that position or some other position that is representation on this panel that represents the economy. The town clearly wants to see commercial replacement of the commercial activity there. The plant owner is clearly engaged in those discussions and entertaining those discussions. And so if it's not if it's not commerce, but I mean, it seems to me it should be commerce. So
I'm gonna ask just a leading question or a clarifying question here for the panel, if there's agreement there, and then maybe this is something we don't necessarily resolve right this minute, but just something for us to ponder. Is it necessarily the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, or is it something more local? Is it, you know, and this could be something that maybe, especially since the town is heavily impacted, you know, BDCC is Regional Development Corporation for the area. Is there a conversation maybe to be had between the town and BDCC about local representation on the panel?
So, I mean, that would definitely be a topic to take up with the executive director of BDCC. But I do think that there does need the notion of commerce being an interest, as is health, as is, you know, the environment, needs to be preserved on the panel. So that's all.
Okay. Commissioner?
I don't think we have anybody here from the Commerce Agency tonight, right? So I would be very uncomfortable speaking for them, and I am also feeling some tension as a representative of a state agency taking a position on this particular item. But I did want... You can't hear me, is that right?
I hear the rain.
Okay, let's try this again. So, as I was saying, I'm not comfortable taking a position on this particular item. The due representative of the agency doesn't appear to be here, but I did want to offer the following observation, and I think Representative Sibilia will understand where I'm coming from. As we, for instance, work on connectivity in the state, it has become clear to me after 3 years in the position, give or take, that there's an intersection between state government workings, local government workings, regional workings, and then citizens. And so eliminating the commerce position, as far as I can tell, means cutting out that state level involvement. I've found it beneficial to have those different perspectives integrated in the broadband context. So I would just bring that to the Commission's attention, trusting the panel to understand that it ill behooves me to take issue with a fellow agency head's position. But I'm just flagging that. Fair enough. I'm just flagging that as a clinical matter, though, because I think that's just an observation I would make about my experience in state government. I also would just, I am very keen to hear from the newer panel members who are local in nature as to what their thoughts are. The senator's observations about the need for a state perspective resonate with me, of course. I think he has a point. After all, the trust fund that would fund, you know, the decommissioning activities and the like is something that was funded by ratepayers, and they have an interest that has to be safeguarded, and that's my job. And I'm not asking to be removed from the panel. So I think we're covered there, but I am very keen to hear what local folks think and local regional folks as well.
Local folks, do we have anybody? Josh, you want to speak?
I guess that's me. I think I spoke at the last meeting with the NRC that I felt that Vernon needs to have a bigger seat at the table on this committee itself. We have one representative from Vernon through this panel. Outside of that, for any Vernon resident or any Vernon official to be on this panel, we have to go through a process of either getting, appointed by the governor through one of the citizen seats or whatever the case may be. It's my opinion that Vernon should have at least 2 seats at this table, possibly even 3. And as far as the redevelopment of the site goes, we mentioned BDC, we mentioned, other organizations that are interested in the redevelopment of the VY site. There is no party more interested in redeveloping the VY site than the town of Vernon and its planning commission specifically. So I would suggest if we're looking for somebody to lead the charge of redevelopment for this site, it should be the host town and it should be the planning commission for that host town.
Why don't we hear from other locals too? Bob, do you want to weigh in?
Only did I agree with everything he said.
Okay.
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah.
Derek, how about you?
I have suggestions for these changes here that pretty much parallel what Josh did point it out. I also think that the first line under the panel membership, it says reduce the Vermont Yankee representative by one. I think those folks have got a lot of skin in this game too, and we should keep that at 2. And in my opinion, change that to 2, or leave that the way it is, and change Vernon to 3. And then we already talked about eliminating IBEW because they no longer exist. And then we were talking in here, it talks about removing Massachusetts. I don't even know if that member exists anymore, and I don't think they have any interest in what we do up here anyway.
Actually, I can talk about that a bit if
Let's follow on June's missive that we hear from the local folk first, and we'll get back to the state. Derek, do you have any thoughts on the mission or construct of the panel?
Do I?
Use the mic.
use a mic.
Yes. Just briefly, I support the idea of having continuing representation by other parts of the state. I think that's important. I think Senator McDonald makes a good point about that, since it is the ratepayer money that is going into this fund up till now, and we should represent them.
Josh, since she's spoken, how about we go to Michael?
I agree with a lot of stuff should stay local, and I want to point out how many people out here are in the committee that we're actually advising, because unless they're watching, there's never anybody here.
I agree that the town of Vernon needs to have ample representation, and I'm just to be clear, just so I understand who from the town of Vernon is actually on the panel. It's Bob, it's Josh, and it's Michael right now, or?
No.
So who?
I'm the only representative of Vernon.
You're the representative of Vernon, but Josh is also a representative of Vernon. Aren't you the head of the town or in Vernon?
I am a governor appointee of this panel. I am not representing Vernon necessarily.
But you hold an office in the town of Vernon, don't you?
I
Or
hold several, yes.
so do you not consider yourself a representative of the town of Vernon?
I will always represent Vernon for this panel. I am a citizen appointee.
You're a citizen-
I think what Josh is saying, if I could help with is that he feels Vernon should have specific representation, as opposed to just right now the enabling statute says that Vernon has one designated representative. Josh is only representing an additional Vernon representative because the governor happened to appoint another Vernon representative who asked to be appointed. So I think what Josh is talking about is that the panel define greater representation for Vernon. Right now it only has one person. So that.
Yes, sir.
If I may, I think the issue is that Mr. Unruh, I hope I'm saying that right, is here in his private capacity. He happens to be a member of the Vernon Select Board, is it? But he has not been commissioned by that Select Board to represent it on this panel. So it's a coincidence, but he is in his own right an appointee of the governor as a private citizen. And I think the same is true for Mr. Leach as well.
Mr. Leach is not a member of Vernon. I don't live there. I do own property there, but I live in...
Understood. So, I mean, the panel is informed by a great deal of local knowledge, but I think the point that we're getting to here is that actual voting rights, for instance, on the panel ought to be doubled, so to speak, for the town of Vernon, if I understand Mr. Unruh correctly.
Bill, go ahead.
So despite the initial efforts to try to reduce the number of members on the panel, it seems that there are two potential positions available if the Secretary of Commerce and Community Development is not a member, nor the representative of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. It could be possible to maintain the 19-member number and increase the number of representatives specifically for the town of Vernon to 3 from 1. And to me, although the rest of the changes in the proposal to revise the statute seem to be reasonable and in keeping with not only the original purposes of the Nuclear Decommissioning Citizens Advisory Panel, but also representative of what we have done over the last several years in trying to meet the statute.
So that almost feels like we're moving towards a motion.
If it is, I'll second it.
Well, let's get the details first here. So, Josh, you had an idea?
I'm happy to make a motion. I make a motion that we accept the changes to the statutes with the deletion of the IBEW member and the member from, what was the office that you mentioned, sir? The Secretary of Commerce and Community Development, and replace those two openings for representatives from the town of Vernon.
I'll second that.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. For any discussion?
Yes. First, my understanding was that this was the first evening in a discussion about a possible new reconfiguration of this panel. And that what had been presented to us this evening was the opening of a discussion that would take place over a period of time. It appears that the motion now is that period of time has come and gone, and this will be the recommendation. I think that is a mistake for this panel. I have a couple reasons. If anybody here stopped at the co-op downtown in Brattleboro today, they would have seen a petition of the 3 local towns dealing with the Economic Development Authority and role here locally, aimed in some part, no small part, about how to deal with the difficulties that these local communities are going to undergo with the closing of the plant, future property values in Vernon, tax base that is eroding, etc., etc. That is going on in this town today and in this area today, and it's a good thing. This panel was established to deal with what's going to happen next with Vermont Yankee, and that has been decided. The legislature is going to now look at the liability that all Vermonters who buy electricity have as a result of this agreement with NorthStar. Because if the NorthStar deal goes south, the entire state is on the hook, not just the locals. And if there's a question of whether or not NorthStar should be directed to halt, to stop, or to quit spending decommissioning money because what's going on turns out to be not as good as what we had all hoped for. The people on this panel are going to be stuck with saying, this isn't working as we had expected, or they're going to say, if we say it's time to stop and save the rest of the money, there goes the local economy, the local truck drivers, etc. I think that the chair was right when he said this was the opening part of the discussion, and this panel and its majority members here locally would better serve their communities if they were very careful about what replaces this panel and recognize that the state has been open, generous, and considerate these last couple years of the problems that are challenges here locally. But the state, now that this deal has been formalized, is going to say there's a role to be reinstituted that sees that inspections are checked to see that money is being spent wisely, and that's likely to happen. And I would hope that the panel members consider that before acting hastily and suggest what might happen next.
So I'm gonna. So I think
Thank you very much for
Sure.
allowing me to
Yep.
discuss this proposal. that's
You're welcome.
before us.
I think the bigger issue is actually procedurally, we did not warrant a vote tonight. So we've got a motion on the table, we're having discussion, but I just want to say procedurally, we talked about discussion, but we didn't warn action. So I see Laura and I see Bill. Who wants to go first? Bill?
I just wanted to share with the audience that I appreciate the senator's remarks, and there are representatives on this panel and there are agencies in the state that are working daily to ensure that the agreements between the parties in the Public Utilities Commission docket are aware of every step that's being taken and trying to track all of the steps to verify that the agreements are met, that the decommissioning is being accomplished in a timely and efficient manner. And so it's good that we have representatives from the state agencies that represent those parties, as well as Wyndham Commission, a Regional Planning Commission, which is a party to the docket. And so I don't want the audience to think that there is no oversight. I think, in fact, tonight we saw presentations by the Public Service Department and the Agency of Natural Resources that describe quite clearly that there are numerous parties, many of them working full-time just on this project, evaluating the expenditures, evaluating the work schedules, evaluating the work and the conditions in the environment and in the community to ensure that what was hoped for in the agreements between NorthStar, the state of Vermont, are not only maintained for our purposes, but because we have joint goal to finish this project early, on time, and within budget, that it is also to the satisfaction of NorthStar and its contractors.
Laura, you had a question?
Two. I have two, actually. One is a process question. So I'm assuming that this would be legislation that we would propose that legislators on this committee or in this region carry up to the legislature to have passed in the coming year. So just making sure that we have that framing, that is okay. And then I do want to go back. Thank you for pointing out that this was not a warned vote. I think it's important maybe to do a little more diligence on this commerce piece. I will not vote for this, well, as an ex officio, but not yet. Right. So I would not support this in the legislature without the commerce piece on it. I can tell you that. I think it's really important for a number of reasons. I think the senator has made a good point with regard to the ratepayers. And I certainly know that the department, that the Agency of Commerce is quite concerned about ratepayers and has engaged in rate increase discussions recently. So I think it would behoove them to maintain an eye on this, as well as I stated earlier, very important for the town and you know, the plant owner looking at commercial uses for that property. There's a lot of energy around that.
So I'm just gonna, so Laura brings up, and this point has come up a few times. Bob?
Clarification. I'm sorry. I'm not used to needing a mic. This thing that's been handed out, it said it was last updated 2018, is this in effect right now?
What's the, not the items that are in blue, but, or red, but what's in black and what's not, and what's been struck out is what's in statute right now.
Okay, so what's in black is in fact in effect right now today, and the blue is somebody's proposed changes?
From the Issues Committee meeting that you participated in.
Gotcha. Okay,
So,
thank you.
so I want to go back to something that, so we've heard a few times now recommendations that the panel should in fact consider taking up the socioeconomic impacts, economic development, reuse of the site, well-being of the town.
I will clarify that Commerce has been on this committee.
No, I'm not talking about the agency. I'm talking about the larger topic.
Oh, adding that in?
Because right now, from its inception, that was excluded. That is not part of the charge of this panel.
So I've looked at the charge a couple of times, and I think the role that Commerce has been playing when we're talking about rates, when we're thinking about how quickly that site is ready to be reused, those are all issues that Commerce, I think, should be interested in.
So I guess I'm asking the larger question, which is, it would seem to me that for those folk who feel that socioeconomic impacts, economic development, reuse of the site, as part of the Issues Committee, should look at what should the language of the enabling statute be that actually empowers the panel, beyond the Secretary of Commerce having an appointee, actually change that as to be part of the mission of what NDCAP considers. And so I don't know that we can resolve that tonight, but it seems to me that that's an issue that the Issues panel might want to discuss and bring back to the larger panel.
May I have 30 more seconds?
Absolutely.
So I would just clarify, I thought it was fine to keep it as it is. I think what you're saying is to add an additional focus thinking about the future reuse, and I think that's actually quite a good idea. But I do think that we need that state level involvement from Commerce.
Yeah, so it sounds like that it's two things, but I guess I don't know that we need a vote, but I guess it would be helpful to me thinking about how we go forward with this, because this would be a fairly substantial change to the mission. Just kind of a nod of the head. Is this something that the panel should further deliberate about adding the economic piece to the NDCAP puzzle?
Not in my opinion, no.
So a couple things on that point. One, as a lawyer looking at the statute, the presence of the Commissioner or Secretary of Commerce, coupled with the very broad language that presently exists in 3, I would suggest a creative lawyer could drive a Mack truck through that and say that economic local issues are already on the table. The question before us is one of self-governance, whether the panel itself wants to take its charge in that direction. And I think when people like Mr. Unruh speak up, I'm really listening. But so I don't think further language on that point is necessary, but I don't think it's harmful to specify it if that makes the panel more comfortable. The fact that the blue language uses the word stakeholders, again, to me implies folks who have an economic interest in what happens in this region, just as it implies the interests of ratepayers who have paid into that fund and who conceivably are on the hook for more if that clarification ever comes through the court system. So, but to return to what we're doing here tonight, I think what we're learning preliminarily is, at least what I've learned, is the local sentiment, if I can grossly simplify, is that there needs to be a loud and strong voice for local concerns on this panel, and some on the panel feel that actual lawful representation has not been had in the form of how this panel is made up to date. There is also a strong sentiment, perhaps held by others, that there needs to be a state perspective, and I agree with that. My own view, I'm not trying to amend Mr. Unruh's motion. I think the conversation has made clear it is perhaps premature, but I think it was a very helpful conversation starter for us. So I thank Mr. Unruh for that. But my own thoughts in this direction would be add more members before you insist on taking some out. So forgive me, Dr. Irwin. I would probably leave the Secretary of Commerce in, and I'll be happy to take my medicine when she comes to my office and yells at me. But I would keep that person in, and I would eliminate the IBEW reference and simply add a second representative of the town of Vernon. Would be my view.
Bill, you had a comment?
Just a kind of point of order. You mentioned that we needed to warn a vote. I don't think we've ever had a specific warning for any of the votes taken on this panel previously. We do warn this meeting, but...
We specifically warn when we're approving something.
We do, okay.
And I believe we've warned when we vote on the advisory positions. So typically, in my experience, just as a practitioner of also open meeting law, when you're making a decision, you have to let the public know that you're making a decision at that meeting.
Okay.
And now, if there's another parliamentarian or something that wants to weigh in on that, that's been our practice, and that's been the practice I've seen in most towns and other public bodies. But if there's disagreement with that, I'm all for hearing it. But
thank you,
Josh.
I don't necessarily have a disagreement with it, but I think it should, if that's the way we're going to conduct business, that every single meeting should be warned that a vote can happen.
Yeah, we can check to see if that broad requirement is acceptable. That's probably the question.
It is for local select boards all around the state, so I don't know why we would be any different.
Okay. Because this is actually a state panel, I think this would be something good for the Secretary of State to weigh in on. I just want to add one thing. Myself and Derek and Bill, I think, are probably the 3 longest serving members on the panel. Commissioner Tierney, it's really refreshing to hear you feel that the existing statute gives us latitude to talk about the socioeconomic impacts of the closure. Your predecessor, and he's not here to defend himself, I can assure you that as I would try to bring that up, that was generally not an accepted position. Hold on one second. And also, this actually gets to the point of where and this is another issue that we need to discuss, and this is an issue that I brought up in my comments previously, about having those entities that are to be advised, having a vote as to what they're going to be advised about. That's one of the challenges, because one of the charges, right, is to advise the governor, the General Assembly, the agencies of the state, and the public on issues related to decommissioning of the VYMPS. And I've always felt it was just an odd arrangement to where the agencies and even the General Assembly have a vote on what they're to be advised about. It feels very Politburo-esque. And so to me, that's another topic, again, that we just need to discuss. It's been, and this is another major change, and this is one of the reasons why I'm, maybe premature to vote on this. We've not discussed the provision to change voting to ex officio. And that's another very major change that we need to take into account. So let's see, I'm just going to do a time check. It is now 8:20. It feels like we're getting some good feedback as far as things that we need to look at, which is Vernon having greater representation, this consideration about whether or not economic development and reuse of the site should be a topic to be considered, and that ties into the Agency of Commerce and Community Development. having a seat remaining. I've raised the ex officio or the voting question. What I was wondering is, we don't have many people here from the public, but we've got a couple. I'm wondering if at this point, how you guys would like to proceed. Do you want to continue this conversation? Do you want to pitch this back to the Issues Committee to come back with some tighter proposal in different language? Do you want to hear from the public? How would you guys like to proceed? Alyssa?
I move that we send it back to the Issues Committee to work on. Second.
So it looks like a motion in 2 seconds. Any discussion?
Yes. Yes.
There you are.
Do we have, I mean, have we highlighted, are there, major issues here? Or are we just wanting to create the space to come back, so that people have an opportunity to digest this and come back in an informed manner? I'd just like to be clear if we're looking at kind of a major rewrite, which is not something I'm hearing or seeing a need for, or if it's just a time and space thing.
My sense of the room is that folks are grappling with this issue more concretely today. Kicking it back to the Issues Committee, to me, sounds more like I need time to digest this and come back and have further discussion with this panel. I have in mind, Representative Sibilia, your framing at the outset of the conversation. If we're going to move on this in the legislative session, we need to tee it up. And I don't know that we have the time to do that unless we have additional meetings. But I'll defer to your expertise on that point. I would like to make one point with deference to the folks who have joined us more recently. I think we need to not lose success, the view of sight of some success that this panel has had, because this is a conversation that is actually not new to the panel. It's been going on for about a year and a half, but we are now moving toward, we're tapering toward a decision point, and what's become clear tonight is we're not quite there yet, but we have a better understanding now, I think, of what we'd like to do if we're going to do something in the composition arena. You were shaking your head about time constraints for preparing legislation. Perhaps you could shed light on that.
Yeah, just to clarify, and I actually don't have the deadline for new. I think it's December, November.
Yeah, mid-December.
However, committees will be able to introduce legislation. So this is something that we can introduce once the session comes in through, I would think. I'm happy to talk with my chairman about that.
And I just want to add one other just procedural or observation, I guess, which is that, so tonight we put this on the agenda late because we hadn't met for a while, so we had a lot to catch up on. I think we need, like the next meeting, this is the topic of conversation. We have a very brief update, and then we have this discussion. Because right now I think we're towards the end of the day, towards the end of the night. And so that's, if we have a motion on the table, which we're discussing. We actually have two motions on the table. Sorry about it. I didn't do a good job as chair, but and soon that's going to end because we have election staff tonight. But what I would suggest is that we have the vote on whether or not to take this back to the Issues Committee. The Issues Committee convenes, bring us back a refined proposal to be discussed at a November, early December meeting, and I think we'll make greater progress there. That would be my suggestion. Oh, go ahead.
If I may, so it's not clear to me whether we're sending just back to the Issues Committee just the specifics of who is on the panel, or whether we're sending more comprehensive feedback on the statute as a whole, because there are some changes here or some discussion questions that came up that we don't have time for now, but that I think are very important. And one of them is the continued funding of NDCAP. What I have not seen here, but was hoping we could talk about tonight, was whether on page 2 in item, G6, there is anybody besides me on the panel who agrees that the monies for this panel should not be coming out of the general funds that, or better said, the gross receipts that fund my department. They should be coming from NorthStar at this point, in my opinion, because fundamentally we're here to grapple with these questions because they are engaged in an activity which, if it goes well for them, will be profitable. If it doesn't go well, will be bad for my people and conceivably Vermonters at large. So that's just something I wanted to put that out there for the panel to consider as well. Representative Sibilia, you're nodding your head, and I think Senator McDonald will confirm that in the last legislative session we had much discussion about the state of financing for my agency, and it's just time that the cost driver bear the cost, if you ask me.
So I'm just trying to keep score. I've got at least four major issues. One is representation for Vernon. Another is economic, more explicit language, giving the panel ability to engage on economic development related to the plant closure. Funds for the panel, and then also include remaining keeping ACCD representation on the panel, and then also the question about just again, we need to, maybe the language is here, but have further discussion about the ex officio voting requirements. Any other major topics that the issues committee will need to take up? Alyssa?
I think the panel in its current composition has been very effective, and it plays a very important role in terms of the decommissioning. It's been an honor to serve on the panel. A couple of things. I agree that we should kick it back to the Issues Committee. I think the funding of the panel is a major issue. I think one of the areas that the panel that I'd like to see more activity around is actually educating members of the panel as to some of the issues that we're going to be confronting as decommissioning proceeds. It's my understanding that with, by the way, with Maine Yankee, and this information came from Ray Shaddis, who I know had engineered an understanding with NorthStar to create another panel, another stakeholder panel, which I didn't really ever understand what the desirability of having another body, but the way I understand it, it is to bring people like Mr. Shaddis, not necessarily even as a representative of the New England Coalition on Nuclear Pollution, but just someone who spent 30 years of his life focused on what's happening at other plants around the nation and what the experience has been at those plants, because it's very informative. And I think that we need to have more experts of that nature here to call upon. So I think the funding's a big issue. At Maine Yankee, the company, as part of the decommissioning, paid some $300,000 per year to pay the salary of the nuclear engineer for the duration of the decommissioning, plus 20 years beyond that. Now, as far as I can tell, we're footing a lot of the bill for activities that relate strictly to this oversight of the decommissioning, and the public and the state deserve a break on that, particularly when the decommissioning fund is being used. My understanding is that approximately 60% and change of the decommissioning fund is going to outside consultants, and the actual work being done, another 33 or so percent, 35%, I'm not clear exactly on the numbers, is going back to pay NorthStar itself. If NorthStar was to allot a half a percentage of its total payment of the decommissioning fund to NorthStar back to the public here, that would be about $1 million. And that would be a half of a percentage of the 35% or so that they are consuming from the decommissioning fund. It doesn't seem like a lot to ask for the company to step up and to pay for the costs associated with decommissioning, as has been practiced at other plants. One last point. Although we're removing the IBEW because there's no longer a union at the plant, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't, as citizens and as the state, still be concerned with the experience of workers that are there at the plant. And I don't have an answer for that, but I'd like to go on record as saying that if there's another entity that could step in and speak on behalf of, you know, where are the workers coming from? What are they being paid? How are they being safeguarded? That's not NorthStar. I think that should be of interest to us as citizens. So I'll leave it at that, but I do think that going back to, I would also like to point out Sarah Coffey is not here tonight, but she is a representative, a state representative of the town of Vernon, and she is also, I think there was a change that brought her on as a representative, she was brought on recently. Right, okay, so there's the representative. I'm not disagreeing that Vernon deserves more representation. I'm just saying Sarah Coffey is in fact a state representative for Vernon that is sitting on the panel and providing that role as well.
Okay. So, thank you. So I'm going to wrap this up. So, in addition to the other topics that I wrote, so I'm going to review this again. Representation for Vernon, guys? Representation for Vernon, economic development, and mitigating economic impacts, funds for the panel, whether or not ACCD should continue to have a seat, and that kind of ties back to that second item. Ex officio, I think it's more we're just bringing that back. I don't know, the proposal's already there. And then continued discussion about the IBEW/labor representation. I want to bring this to a vote. About bringing these issues, having especially the issues committee focus on these issues, doesn't mean that they're limited to that. Are there any other specific issues that the issues committee should take up, or is this a good start?
That's a good start.
Okay. So can we vote on having the issues committee further deliberate on these issues and bringing them back to the panel? Is that the motion basically that's on the table? And then Josh's motion, Josh, we can.
I'll rescind my motion.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so have a vote. So it'd be all those in favor of having the issues committee specifically talk about these issues that I just went over. And this is really awkward, awful.
You just listed them.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And of course, they can bring up other issues too. But basically, bring these issues back to the issues committee and then have them bring it back to the panel, where at the next meeting we would focus primarily on this topic. So, Laura, we'll start with you. Senator?
Aye.
Bob?
Aye.
Derek?
Aye.
Josh?
Aye.
Michael?
Aye.
Alyssa?
Aye.
Me? Yes.
Aye.
Emily?
Aye.
Aye.
Corey?
Aye.
Aye.
I'm sorry, Bob?
Aye.
Good. Awesome. Thank you very much. Now then, we need to take public comments on panel composition and enabling statute. Anything? Clay? Anybody else?
Actually, before we move on from this, I do have a message from Paul Mark, and I think this would be a good time to read it into the record.
Okay. Remind us who Paul Mark is.
Yeah. For those of you who don't remember, Paul Mark is the representative for the Massachusetts towns on this panel. So these were the towns that used to be part of the Vermont Yankee Emergency Planning Zone. We don't see a lot of Paul because frequently he's a member of the Massachusetts legislature, and they frequently meet throughout the entire year. So he's frequently not available. However, in this last round of I'm trying to multitask here. In this last round of getting a meeting date set, he reached out to me when he realized he was getting all of these emails about setting a date, and he said, I resigned from the panel several years ago, is what it amounted to. And he and I did have a brief discussion that we had heard that, but we had never received anything official. So we talked a little bit more, and he said that he's hoping that the governor of Massachusetts will appoint someone else, but he is willing to continue to serve until such time as Governor Baker names a replacement. And he sent me something just before the meeting started here, so I'm just going to read that now. It just says, we ended up in formal session of the Massachusetts House today debating on a $720 million surplus budget bill, so I'll be unable to attend tonight. But if you want to announce to the panel that we have spoken, I am still the Massachusetts member of the panel at this time, it turns out. And I do plan on attending moving forward until I hear differently from my governor. So, Representative Mark will attempt to be here. I will certainly keep him aware, as I do with all of you when other meetings, future meetings are coming up. So thank you.
I'm not sure I heard. Does he feel that...
Use the mic.
Yeah, I can barely hear you, Bob.
Okay, Don? Yeah. Did you get a feeling from him that he thought it was appropriate that they still have a representative? Or did he feel it really was, I mean, he hasn't been here for 2 years. Is it something that he feels we should continue to have a member when they're not impacted anymore?
We didn't discuss that at all, and I would hate to speculate on his behalf. But I would say that just from the statement, the fact that he's willing to say that, yes, there should be a replacement, that maybe he's thinking that, but that's speculation on my part.
To that end, and I'm not trying to create work for Tony and the commissioner, but if it's not happened, would it be appropriate to send a letter to the respective governments of New Hampshire and Massachusetts asking what their position is on this topic?
Do you mean the NDCAP panel sends the letter, or are you saying, June, would you look into this?
I'm thinking actually somebody as representative of the governor.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. There has been convo about this, and I'm surprised it hasn't been resolved, but I'm pleased to hear from this gentleman because it indicates that the tickling happened, at least in Massachusetts, but I understood that something was in the works for New Hampshire, so I can look into it. And you're not making work for me, that's
okay. And just again, for those watching at home, the idea is that these are state level conversations, and so it should be appropriately like among the governors to have the conversation with each other or their designees, such as the Commissioner of Public Service.
I think that's a smart way to do business. If NDCAP wanted to send a letter, it could, but that's probably the smarter way to go. So I'll be happy to look into it.
Okay, without any delay, I would like us to move to election of officers. So as I recall, we have two. We have chair and vice chair. I had agreed to serve as chair for a year. My exec board gave me the thumbs up to serve as chair for a year. I will still remain on the panel unless Wyndham Regional Commission wants to replace me with somebody else, so I don't see anybody else in the commission jumping to do that. So I will still be on the panel, but I don't have any interest in remaining, or frankly don't have the capacity to continue to serve as chair. So I'm taking myself out of the running. So I would ask if we have nominations for chair.
I'd like to nominate Josh for chairman.
We have a nomination for Josh Unruh.
I'd like to nominate Sarah Coffey for chair.
I'm not exactly sure the ethics of nominating someone in absentia, especially someone who has told me she's not interested in serving as chair. Alyssa? And you can, go ahead.
I'd like to nominate Corey Daniels as chair.
Any other nominations?
Move the nomination to be closed.
Do you have a second? Okay. So we have a nomination for Josh as chair and Corey as chair. How would we, do we want to put our heads down on the table like we did in the elementary school? And well, I guess that's the question. So do the nominees accept? Sorry. Thank you. I don't run many elections, so.
I'm confused.
No, the chair does not, there's no limitation on who the chair is. If there is no chair, it is by default the Commissioner of Public Service.
I'm confused a little bit.
Mike,
Use the mic, Bob.
I heard a nomination for chair, and I thought I heard another nomination for chair, and you said it was for vice chair.
No.
Okay.
We have two nominations for chair. We have Josh and we have Corey.
Okay.
So the next question is, do the nominees accept the nomination? Corey?
I do not feel it's appropriate as a owner representative to be the chairman of the committee. I feel the technical expertise that we provide and the information exchange and the outreach with the community is appropriate, but to serve in the capacity of the chairmanship is not, in my opinion, the right position for me.
Okay.
So I would like to decline the nomination.
Josh, do you accept the nomination? Yes. Do we have any other nominations? We're closing nominations. So do we have what do we vote by acclamation? Where do we? So that's right. We've got to do a roll call vote now for Josh for chair. Laura?
Yes.
Senator?
Yes.
Bob? Or is that Bob next? Yes. Bob, did you vote? Okay. Derek?
Yes.
Josh?
Abstain.
Michael? Lissa?
No.
Chris? Yes.
Yes.
Commissioner?
Yes.
Commissioner?
Aye.
Bill? Corey?
Abstain.
Yes.
Bob?
Yep.
Gustafson? Okay. All right. Josh, congratulations. You're now chair.
Thank you, I think.
Now then, do we have nominations for vice chair?
I nominate Bob Leach, vice chair.
Any other nominations?
I nominate Chris Hanley.
So we have Bob Leach, me. Any other nominations?
I nominate Alyssa Weinman, not knowing whether she's interested in serving again.
Any other nominations for vice chair? Okay, now we'll see if they accept. Bob, do you accept your nomination as vice chair?
I accept the nomination.
Lissa, do you accept your nomination as vice chair?
Yes.
I do not accept my nomination as vice chair.
No surprise.
Okay, so is everybody comfortable if we just do a roll call vote on this? Right. I know it's awkward. We can do a secret ballot if somebody wants to tear up some paper. But that's what I'm just asking. We're all adults. Our feelings going to be hurt? I don't think everybody, so. Okay. So, roll call vote, does anybody feel like we have to do this by secret ballot, or can we do a roll call vote on the? Okay. All right, Laura?
Lissa.
Senator? Bob?
Myself.
Derek?
Listen.
Bob?
Josh? Bob? Okay, Michael? Lissa?
Can I vote for myself?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Don't be shy.
I will.
Okay. Did you voted for yourself? Okay.
Yes.
I'm going to abstain.
Alyssa.
Lissa.
Lissa.
Abstain.
Bob.
Bob?
Alyssa.
Okay. I believe the Lissas have it. Is that correct?
I lost count. I'm sorry. It went pretty fast. My apologies.
Okay. So, unless there's a dispute, I believe the Lissas have it. But do we need to go back and re-record? Because we need to record this for the minutes.
You have it? Okay.
Awesome. She's got the
Our
okay.
note recorder has it.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay.
That's why we have her.
So I gladly. Josh, do you want to take over from here? Or do you want me to finish out the meeting?
You go ahead.
Okay.
It's over anyway.
So any other general public comments to the panel? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Before he speaks.
It was reported, I don't remember where in the press, I read that someone, I think it was a member of this panel, was of the opinion that the panel should be dissolved. And does anyone on the panel know anyone on the panel have that opinion or know if that was expressed in the media?
The reason that I voted against my chairman now, who I look forward to working with, is because I thought that had been expressed at the NRC meeting, and that alarmed me.
Okay. So it was at
But
the
maybe I misunderstood.
Okay. I guess a straight question. Was it your opinion that this panel should be dissolved?
I think she misunderstands a lot.
I wasn't basing it on what she said. It was something I read, I thought I read or heard in the paper. So no.
No, I seriously doubt you ever read that.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, any other public comment? All right, scheduling, okay. So we have on here scheduling a November 2019 panel meeting and wrap up. If we could do November, I think that's a good idea, so that we're not starting to get into, I just know in December we seem to have weather issues and everything else. So, Tony, did you have any, have you already like do you have a notion just based on having coordinated this for a while?
Well, just going by some of the feedback, I know I know we're trying to avoid conflicting now that Josh Unruh, especially now that he's chair, that we would want to avoid Vernon's select board meetings. So that rules out the first and third Tuesday of the month, if I remember correctly.
You are correct, but it also rules out the first and third Wednesdays of the month now that we are in budget season.
Okay, I wasn't aware of that. So, hold on here, I'm making a little tally for myself here. So you said first and third Wednesdays.
Thursdays used to work pretty well for folk.
Yeah. Looking at those restrictions, and also assuming that we do not want to attempt to meet on Veterans Day because it's a holiday and most of our spaces will likely be closed. I think we're looking, if we want to do Thursday, we're probably looking at either November 7th or November 14th.
And we also just need to take into account how fast the Issues Committee can get together and deliberate.
Yeah. And if we want to look at Mondays, we're looking at November 4th and November 18th. I don't know if we want to go to November 25th because that is, we're getting into the week of Thanksgiving.
We may need to look at December. We may, I just muttered to the world. We may need to look to December. Again, taking into account just trying to get the Issues Committee, how long it's going to take to herd the cats to get them into the room.
Exactly.
I'm just basing this on experience. Right after I said that maybe December shouldn't be, I'm just going to throw out there.
December 5th?
That's what I was going to suggest.
I agree, December 5th.
Anybody not? Does that work for most people? All right. Hey, look at that.
Hallelujah.
I may be able to call in.
Okay. Thank you, Bill. Do you is that a are you able to call in, or do you need us to reschedule around you?
I don't think so. I'm taking away from what I am on this legislation.
So, sounds like December 5th. Awesome. And Tony will schedule the issues committee. All right. Any other thoughts, anecdotes, anything else anybody want to share before we adjourn?
I just have one. I was remiss earlier in not publicly thanking Tony for his work on that summary history. He did produce that in our office.
I want to thank Chris Campany for being a great chair for the past year. He brings so much knowledge, but more importantly, he brings a level of decorum to the panel that I've always appreciated. The level of respect between members of the panel has been always exemplary, and I hope it will be carried out in the year ahead.
I second that sentiment, except I know it's going to be carried out in the year ahead.
Thank you very much. Do we have a motion to adjourn? Oh, you're what? We have a motion. Second? All right. Thank you, everybody. See you in December.